My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely. This letter arrived at a San Francisco police station in 2013. The FBI lab's analysis of it was inconclusive. This is a problem, because according to the FBI's official 17-year investigation, which was closed in 1979, John Anglin likely drowned in the San Francisco Bay in 1962. This is an even bigger problem, because according to the U.S. Marshals Service, the case is not closed. The warrants for John Anglin, his brother Clarence, and Frank Morris are still active. This isn't a story about whether 3 men escaped a prison. This is a story about how a case can be simultaneously closed and active for decades, how 2 arms of the U.S. government can't agree on a single reality, and how an official truth was built on the testimony of the one man who failed. From 1934 to 1963, Alcatraz was not just a prison. It was an idea. It was, by design, the psychological crushing of hope. Its security was multi-layered. New iron bars, a dozen checks a day, and its greatest asset, the cold, rough waters of the Pacific. The prison's purpose was to hold men who had a history of escapes. The institutional policy was simple. If you vanished, you were presumed drowned. The conclusion was written before any crime was even committed. But in 1960, the system made a critical administrative failure. It took Frank Morris, an intelligent man with repeated attempts to escape. It took the Anglin brothers, also with a history of attempted escapes. And it took Alan West, another escape risk. They all knew each other from previous prisons, and the administration assigned them to adjoining cells. In its attempt to warehouse all its escape risks, Alcatraz had inadvertently created an expert think tank for its own defeat. They didn't just break the system built the team that would break it. From 1934 to 1963, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was not merely a prison. It was an idea, a final, brutal statement in the American war on crime. It was the ultimate maximum security prison, a final destination for the penal system's most intractable inmates. Located on a lonely island in San Francisco Bay, the Rock was designed for a singular purpose, the psychological crushing of hope. Its security was a trinity of the physical, the procedural, and the environmental. The 1934 redesign of the old military fort included tougher iron bars and strategically positioned guard towers. Procedurally, inmates were subjected to a dozen checks a day, but the prison's greatest asset was the environment itself, the cold, rough waters of the Pacific. Escape, by all measures, was impossible. This reputation of invincibility was the system's core function. But this system had a very specific mandate. It was not just for notorious public enemies like Al Capone. It was built specifically to hold criminals who had a history of escapes. The institution's response to the few who challenged this mandate was definitive. In 1937, when inmates Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe vanished, their bodies were never recovered. Officials presumed them drowned. This established the institutional precedent, the official truth. In the absence of a body, the conclusion was death by drowning. The system was designed to believe in its own infallibility. Disappearance was not escape. It was simply a form of dying. And it was this very policy, the decision to concentrate all of the system's highest escape risks into one inescapable location, that would become its fatal flaw. The prison's own policy of concentrating its highest escape risks created the very conditions for a sophisticated conspiracy. The men who would form this conspiracy were not random cellmates. They were, in fact, a collection of career criminals who already knew each other and, critically, all shared that one specific resume, a history of escape attempts. First, Frank Morris, number AZ1441. He arrived in January 1960. He would come to be considered the mastermind, of the escape. Morris was not just a bank robber. His transfer to Alcatraz was a direct result of his repeated attempts to escape various prisons. He was known by the Bureau for his intelligence. Then came the brothers, John Anglin, AZ 1476, and Clarence Anglin, AZ 1485. They arrived in late 1960 and early 1961. Poor farmers' sons from Georgia, they had a proclivity for burglary, and, just like Morris, a history of attempted escapes from other facilities. The fourth member of this budding conspiracy was Alan West. Though convicted of car theft, his transfer was identical. He was sent to Alcatraz, after an unsuccessful escape attempt at another prison. The system had performed its duty perfectly. It had identified 4 of the federal system's most dedicated escape artists and contained them within its ultimate fortress. But containment is not isolation. In what can only be described as a critical administrative failure, these 4 men, all with known histories of escape, all of whom knew each other from previous stints in prison, were assigned to adjoining cells. The prison, in its bureaucratic zeal to warehouse all its escape risks in one place, had done something catastrophic. It had inadvertently created an expert think tank for its own defeat. The very walls meant to separate them now served as their shared boundary, a common problem to be solved. The institutional policy, designed to centralize risk, had instead centralized expertise. This single administrative blunder is the key to understanding everything that followed. The 1962 escape was not a failure of the prison's modern, 1934-era security. The strategically positioned guard towers saw nothing. The tougher iron bars held. The breach was, at first, a failure of its original 19th-century architecture, the crumbling, unguarded utility corridors built long before the prison's modern renovation. But more profoundly, it was a failure of its 20th-century administrative policy. The system had gathered the most creative minds in escape, put them in the same room, and dared them to find a way out. The plan, which began in December 1961, was a masterpiece of covert engineering and social manipulation. For 6 months, the expert think tank began its work, exploiting the prison's most overlooked flaw, its 19th-century architecture. The men's first targets were the air vent covers at the back of their cells. The concrete around them was old, crumbling, and vulnerable. Their tools were crude, scavenged from the mundane life of the prison. They began with old saw blades, discarded from prison workshops, and spoons, sharpened from the dining hall. But their most sophisticated tool was a homemade drill. Frank Morris, the mastermind, had salvaged the motor from a broken vacuum cleaner, and fashioned it into a rotary drill. With these, they began the painstaking work, drilling closely spaced holes around the vent covers, slowly, night after night, chipping away at the very foundation of their containment. This created the first problem: noise. The escape was a victory of soft, social engineering over hard, physical security. The prison had a designated music hour in the evening. Frank Morris, an accordion player, used this to the group's advantage. The noise of the drilling was meticulously masked by Morris's evening accordion practice. The drone of the instrument provided the perfect acoustic cover for the sound of the motor and the chipping of concrete. The visual deception was just as critical. During the day, the finished holes, a clear sign of their work, were concealed from the guard's view by a suitcase, a piece of cardboard, etc. But the most famous element of the deception was designed to fool the night guards during their routine checks. The conspirators cleverly built dummy heads. They were made from plaster, mixed with flesh tone paint, and topped with real human hair, gathered from the prison barbershop. These heads were placed in their bunks on the nights they worked, creating the illusion of sleeping men. The rudimentary nature of the guards' checks was proven only after the escape was discovered. When one guard, checking on Morris's cell, pushed the dummy head, it rolled Ed, off the bed and bridge, okay, it snows. It was a check that, clearly, had not been performed with any rigor the night before. With the vents removed, the men gained access to a common, unguarded utility corridor behind their cell block. This was the prison's hollow spine, a relic of its 19th century construction, and it was the key. From this corridor, the men climbed to the roof of their cell block. This was a 30-foot-high space, dark, dusty, and, most importantly, completely hidden from the guards. They converted this space into a secret workshop. Here, the true scale of their ambition became clear. While some of the men worked, others kept watch for guards below, using a crude periscope to monitor the patrols. In this secret, elevated workshop, they fabricated their escape gear from stolen and donated materials. They were building a boat, a 6 by 14-foot rubber raft, constructed from more than 50 raincoats that were stolen or gathered over months. The raft's seams were carefully stitched together. Then, they performed a crude but effective form of vulcanization. They sealed the seams using the heat from the prison's hot steam pipes, an idea they had sourced from magazines found in their own cells. They built accessories, wooden paddles, and makeshift life preservers from the same raincoat material. To inflate their 14-foot raft, they converted a musical instrument, likely a concertina, into a tool to inflate the raft, a crude bellows to give their vessel life. Finally, they needed an exit from the building itself. In the workshop, they climbed a network of pipes 30 feet to the ceiling. There, they found a ventilator, which they pried open. To hide this last breach from the guards, they held the ventilator in place with a fake bolt they had meticulously crafted out of soap. For 6 months, they had drilled, painted, stitched, and climbed, all under the illusion of total security. The system, so focused on the bars on the front of the cells, never thought to check the walls behind them. On the evening of June 11, 1962, the trio was ready. They left the dummy heads in their bunks, climbed into the utility corridor, gathered the gear, and exited the building through the roof ventilator. Once on the prison roof, they shimmied down the bakery's smokestack at the rear of the cell house, climbed over the fence, and snuck to the northeast shore of the island, and launched their raft. But there were 4 men in the expert think tank. Only 3 left the island. Alan West was left behind. His fatal error, according to his own testimony, was that he did not have his ventilator grill completely removed in time. The cement he had used to patch it during the day had hardened, sealing him in. By the time he finally broke through, the others were gone. He returned to his cell, exhausted, and, the next day, began his full confession. And this is where the entire story of the Alcatraz escape fractures. Alan West's testimony is a historian's dream but an investigator's dilemma. Our entire, granular understanding of the 6-month escape plan is filtered through the testimony of its one failure. West is the sole source for the most critical details of the plan. It is from West that the FBI learned about the vulcanizing process for the raft. It is from West that they learned the raft's dimensions and the crude bellows used to inflate it. But most importantly, Alan West provided the linchpin for the entire future investigation. He described, in detail, the trio's intended land-based strategy, to row to the mainland, and then to steal clothes and a car. This single piece of information, provided by the failed conspirator, would become the linchpin of the FBI's entire 17-year investigation and its ultimate conclusion. The event's official history, therefore, was written by its one failure. This raises a devastating question that the 1962 investigation never fully processed. What if West was misinformed? What if the trio, wary of a 4th man, simply lied to him about their plans? It is a critical vulnerability in the official narrative. Because if West's testimony about the stolen car plan was wrong, Then the FBI's entire, drowning, conclusion, which, as we will see, rests heavily on the failure of this West-provided plan, is built on a foundation of sand. The official truth of the case was now entirely dependent on the word of the one man who had every reason to cooperate, the one man left behind. Here is the fourth part of your documentary script. When the routine early morning bed check, on June 12, 1962, revealed the dummy heads, the prison went into lockdown. The inescapable prison had been breached. An intensive search was immediately launched by the FBI, the Coast Guard, and the Bureau of Prison Authorities. As the fog burned off the bay, the search quickly recovered a field of debris. This collection of seemingly random flotsam would be gathered, analyzed, and assembled into the core of the official drowning theory. First, a homemade paddle was found floating in the water near Angel Island. This paddle matched one that had been left behind in the secret workshop. Soon after, another discovery, also near Angel Island, a packet of letters sealed in rubber. This packet contained an address book and family photographs belonging to one of the men. To the investigators, this seemed like a grim sign. Surely, men who had successfully landed would not have carelessly lost the personal effects. Then, they found the life vests, or rather, bits of rubber in a tube, and 2 of the 3 homemade preservers. The first vest was discovered washed up on Cronkite Beach. This location was significant. It was north of the Golden Gate Bridge, miles away from Angel Island, suggesting the raft or the men had traveled a great distance. But it was the second vest that would become the smoking gun of the entire case. This vest was found only 50 yards off the shore of Alcatraz. This second vest, found so close to the island, became the FBI's single most compelling piece of evidence for drowning. When investigators examined it, they found teeth marks embedded deep into the stem that had been used to inflate the vest. The FBI turned to their sole informant, Alan West. West's testimony confirmed the group's makeshift valves, simple binder clips, would have failed under pressure. This combination of evidence and testimony created a powerful, grim narrative. To the investigators, these teeth marks represented a struggle to hold the seal for survival. They painted a grim portrait of a man drowning in the frigid water, desperately trying to keep his vest inflated, only 50 yards from the shore he had just escaped. This became the official story. The men launched their raft, it failed almost immediately in the hostile waters, and at least one of them drowned in a desperate fight for air, biting down on the failing valve. But this smoking gun theory had a deep, logical flaw. The official narrative failed to reconcile a fundamental contradiction. How could the men have drowned immediately off the island's shore, as the teeth-marked vest suggested, while their other belongings, including another life vest and a paddle, were discovered miles away, past the Golden Gate Bridge? The evidence pointed in 2 opposite directions at once. One vest suggested an immediate, catastrophic failure at the launch point. The other vest, and the rest of the debris, suggested a long, desperate journey that went past the Golden Gate. The investigation, faced with this contradiction, chose the simpler narrative. It prioritized the grim, compelling story of the teeth marks over the complex, confusing geography of the wider debris field. The official conclusion was set: the men had drowned. The investigation continued, year after year, slowly turning cold. The intensive search became a passive one. Leads dried up. The men, or their bodies, simply vanished. Then, on December 31, 1979, 17 years after the escape, the FBI officially closed its case. Its conclusion was the same one investigators had reached in the first 48 hours. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had, likely drowned. This 17-year investigation was not closed with the discovery of new, dispositive proof of death. It was, instead, a bureaucratic closing of the books. The FBI's rationale was built on 4 key points. First, the hostile environment. The Strong currents and frigid bay water made survival a remote possibility. This was the same assumption the prison was built on. Second, the failure of the land plan. The FBI leaned heavily on the testimony of their star informant, Alan West. His story of a plan to steal clothes and a car became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because the FBI never uncovered any thefts like this, they concluded the men must have never made it to land. The failure of West's plan was the proof of the drowning. Third, the lack of support. Investigators concluded the fugitives' families appeared unlikely to possess the financial means to provide any meaningful, long-term support. Fourth, the argument from silence. For 17 years, no credible evidence emerged to suggest the men were still alive. This was the flaw at the heart of the 1979 conclusion. 3 of their 4 points are arguments from silence. The conclusion was based on an absence of evidence, not the presence of it. No car was stolen. No family contact was proven. No one saw them. Therefore, they must be dead. The one positive argument, the bay's hostile conditions, was simply an assumption of failure. The FBI's 1979 conclusion effectively established a new institutional truth. In the absence of evidence of life, the official conclusion is death. But this bureaucratic tidiness failed to address the single most persistent and awkward fact of the case. It was an anomaly articulated best by Patrick Mahoney, the prison's own launch operator, who had spent days searching the bay. He said, "I felt that they didn't make it, but I thought we'd find a body. We didn't find a body." This was the central anomaly the FBI's drowning theory could never adequately explain. The bay was supposed to be a deadly trap, but the trap, having supposedly sprung, never produced the bodies. The FBI's drowning theory required the bay to be lethal enough to kill them, but convenient enough to hide the evidence. Forever, the mystery of the 1962 escape persists in the 21st century, not just as a folk tale, but because of a fundamental, bureaucratic conflict in the missions of 2 different federal agencies. When the FBI closed its investigative file in 1979, it turned over responsibility to the U.S. Marshals Service. This was not a simple handing off of a cold case. It was the collision of 2 completely different mandates. The FBI's job is to solve crimes. In their view, they solved this one: the men drowned. The case was a historical matter, a closed loop. But the U.S. Marshals Service is a fugitive apprehension agency. Its job is not to solve the past. Its job is to execute warrants in the present. And a federal warrant has a very different set of rules. It can only be cleared by one of 2 things: an arrest, or proof of death. Since no bodies were ever found, proof of death was never established. Therefore, the warrants for Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin remain active by default. This created a state of administrative limbo. The Alcatraz escape is, to this day, simultaneously closed by the FBI and active by the USMS. It exists as a kind of bureaucratic ghost, a file that can be archived but never destroyed. This is not a formality. The U.S. Marshals Service is legally bound to continue the search. As Deputy U.S. Marshal Michael Dyke, one of the lead investigators on the case, stated, "There's an active warrant, and the Marshals Service doesn't give up looking for people." As recently as 2009, he confirmed he was still receiving leads on a regular basis. The USMS investigation remains open and active. The warrants will only expire when the missing men reach the age of 100. This ongoing, active status is not a cold case formality. It is a performative investigation to fulfill a mandate. The USMS continues to solicit new leads, releasing new, age-progressed photos of the trio as recently as June 2022, on the 60th anniversary of the escape. The FBI closed the book, concluding the men were dead. The Marshals Service, bound by procedure, must operate on the premise that they are alive. And as long as that paradox exists, the case can never truly be over. For decades, the FBI's drowning theory was the default conclusion, built on the 1962 assumption that the Bay was an unbeatable, hostile force. But in the 21st century, that assumption was put to a scientific test. In 2014, scientists at Delft University and the Research Institute Deltares in the Netherlands used a sophisticated 3D hydraulic computer model to do what the 1962 investigators could not: recreate the exact tidal and current conditions of the San Francisco Bay on the night of June 11, 1962. Their findings did not just question the FBI's conclusion, they provided the first scientific proof that survival was certainly possible. The study first confirmed that the bay's currents were deadly. It showed that the common wisdom, that the men would have aimed for the nearest landmass, Angel Island, would have been a fatal mistake. On that trajectory, the currents would have swept the men out to sea, just as the FBI had assumed. But the model then identified a narrow, critical launch window. The scientists found that if the men left Alcatraz between 11:30 p.m. and 12 a.m., midnight, the currents would have been in their favor. And if they launched in this precise window, the model showed they could have ridden the outgoing tide to an unexpected place. They would have been propelled by the current, not fighting it, to a landing spot north of the Golden Gate Bridge, near Horseshoe Bay. This was the first aha moment. Horseshoe Bay is adjacent to Cronkite Beach. This is exactly where, in 1962, one of the homemade life vests was found. The 1962 investigation had largely ignored this piece of evidence because it contradicted the drowning at Alcatraz theory. The 2014 model proved it was, in fact, a key breadcrumb. But the model's most stunning revelation came next. The computer simulation predicted that any debris released from this successful landing at Horseshoe Bay, such as a paddle or a lost packet, would have floated in the direction of Angel Island. This was the aha moment. Suddenly, the contradictory debris field from 1962 made perfect sense. The paddle and packet found near Angel Island were not evidence of a failure at Angel Island. They were the breadcrumbs of a successful landing miles away. This 2014 study is a Rosetta Stone for the case. It provides, for the first time, a single, cohesive theory that accounts for all the contradictory physical evidence. The Dutch model retroactively validates the 1962 debris field as a precise breadcrumb trail for a successful landing, not against it. The men did not drown at Alcatraz. They landed at Horseshoe Bay, and the currents, exactly as predicted, washed their lighter debris back toward Angel Island. The study is the most powerful scientific rebuttal to the FBI's 1979 conclusion. It demonstrates that the physical evidence, when read by 21st century science, points toward survival. If the 2014 Dutch study provided the scientific plausibility of survival, this next chapter details the alleged proof. In the 21st century, two explosive pieces of lost evidence have emerged, forcing law enforcement to re-engage with the case. The first is this photograph. In 2015, a History Channel special presented evidence gathered by the Anglin family. The nephews, Ken and David Widner, provided authorities with a photograph given to their family back in 1992 by a family friend named Fred Brizzi. Brizzi was a convicted drug trafficker. His claim was explosive. He said he had run into John and Clarence Anglin in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in 1975. Brizzi, who claimed he was smuggling drugs, said he spent time with them and photographed them on a farm where they were living. This was not just another unsubstantiated rumor. Art Roderick, the retired U.S. Marshal who had led the case for 20 years, called this absolutely the best actionable lead we've had. He had the photo analyzed by a forensic artist. The conclusion: the men in the 1975 photograph were likely, or highly likely, to be the Anglin brothers. Later reports, around 2020, stated that modern, facial recognition matched them to the photo. The family also produced Christmas cards, containing the Anglins' handwriting, that were allegedly received by family members for 3 years after the escape. While experts verified the handwriting was authentic, the envelopes lacked postmarked stamps, making the dates they were delivered unverifiable. The photograph was tantalizing, but the second piece of evidence was a direct voice from the past. In 2018, San Francisco news station KPIX5 exclusively obtained a letter that had been sent to the SFPD's Richmond station 5 years earlier, in 2013. The author stated, quote, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely." The letter went on to detail their fates. It claimed that Frank Morris died in 2008 and Clarence Anglin died in 2011. And then, it made an offer. A deal. The author claimed he was living in Southern California, and wrote, quote, "If you announce on TV that I will be promised to first go to jail for no more than a year and get medical attention, I will write back to let you know exactly where I am. This is no joke." The U.S. Marshals Service, as the sole investigating agency, confirmed the letter was not dismissed. The FBI lab examined it for fingerprints, DNA, and handwriting. The result, inconclusive. As one FBI analyst noted, inconclusive means yes, and it means no, so this leaves everything in limbo. It could not be proven, but crucially, it could not be disproven. Despite this ambiguity, the U.S. Marshals Service considers this lead closed with no merit. But this rejection appears to be operational, not forensic. A federal law enforcement agency cannot and will not negotiate a plea bargain on live television. The letter's demands made it an impossibility, regardless of its authenticity. The case now had a photograph deemed highly likely by forensics and a letter deemed inconclusive. The 20th century ghosts were suddenly, and very materially, present. There is one final piece of evidence. A negative test that is profoundly significant. In February 1964, a partial skeleton of a male in his 30s washed ashore on a beach near Point Reyes. For decades, this was considered a prime candidate for one of the escapees. It was the one body the Bay seemed to have given back. But modern DNA tests were conducted on these bones, likely compared against a clean DNA sample from the exhumed body of the Anglin's brother, Alfred. The results were definitive. The bones didn't belong to any of the escapees. The drowning theory was predicated on the idea that the Bay would claim the bodies. But the one time the Bay produced a body that perfectly fit the time and description, modern DNA ruled it out. This negative test strengthens the "we didn't find a body" anomaly. It suggests the bodies were never in the water to be found. The 1962 Alcatraz escape endures as one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries, not from a lack of evidence, but from a surplus of contradictory evidence. The case is now defined by two irreconcilable narratives, a conflict between two sets of evidence separated by 50 years of science. The case for drowning. This is the official FBI conclusion from 1979. It relies entirely on the assumptions from 1962. It rests on the teeth-marked vest found 50 yards from shore as definitive proof of a struggle and drowning. It is built on the hostile nature of the Bay, the 17-year silence from the men, and the fact that the land-based plan described by Alan West, the stolen car, the stolen clothes, never materialized. In this narrative, the men are dead, and the case is closed. The case for survival. This narrative is built on a 21st century re-analysis of the event. It posits that the 2014 Dutch computer model proves survival was scientifically plausible. It uses that Dutch study as a Rosetta Stone, to reinterpret the 1962 debris field not as evidence of failure, but as a precise map of their successful landing at Horseshoe Bay. This narrative is bolstered by the negative DNA test on the 1964 skeleton and finds its climax in the highly likely 1975 Brazil photograph and the forensically inconclusive 2013 letter from John Anglin. The central conflict is no longer between the escapees and the prison, but between the FBI's historical, bureaucratic assumption of failure and the new, compelling data of plausibility. The official 1979 conclusion, that the men drowned based on hostile waters and the failure of a land plan reported by a single informant, has been systematically dismantled by modern analysis. The 2014 Dutch study, in particular, provided a scientifically sound model that validates the physical evidence as a map to survival. While the Brazil photograph and the 2013 letter remain uncorroborated, they are now supported by a bedrock of scientific plausibility. The 1962 Alcatraz escape has become a dynamic, unsolved mystery where 21st century science, hydrodynamic modeling, DNA analysis, facial recognition, is actively relitigating a 20th century event. The U.S. Marshals Service, bound by its mandate, must continue to operate on the premise of survival. The warrants remain active. The case file remains open. And until Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin are confirmed deceased or reach their 100th birthdays, the Rock still holds its secrets.